Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the QT2 Systems Podcast 10 Tips to Crush Your Next Triathlon. In this series, we have been speaking with our coaches in their areas of expertise, and they've been sharing with us all their tips on how you can race your best on the day that matters. So we are on to episode 9, which focuses on the taper. And today we have QT2 Systems owner and longest time coach, Tim Snow. Welcome, Tim.
How you doing, Ray? How's it going?
Good. So happy to have you here on this one because I was telling you before that as a coach, the taper is always the most challenging part of writing a training program. But at the same time, I feel like it's the part that a lot of athletes don't appreciate the importance of. So I just want to just start with a real, I'm going to simple but not easy question. What is a taper?
Yeah, as well, just to go back to what you're saying, like the taper is that time frame when we're in the throes of training and all those weeks leading up and build. That in our brain, we can't wait for the taper, right? But then when it comes, the athlete wants nothing to do with the taper, right? And so I mean, it's an interesting it's an interesting animal because it's the thing we strive for the entire time that we're training, and then when we get there, we don't want to be there because it's an uncomfortable period. It's when doing we're not doing the stuff we normally do, say in the way that we normally do it, and that's uncomfortable for um, a lot of people, a lot of type A personalities. What is the taper? The taper is that stretch between the real kind of definition of fitness and the race that really is aimed at allowing allowing the athlete to access all of the fitness that they spent 20 weeks building, say. It's the period of time where you 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 take the cover off and allow the body to show, demonstrate everything that it's been building up to it,
Mhm.
right? And that's the I mean at the end of the day, that's the gist of it, right? It's the it's the means through which we get to, or it's the threshold or the portal through which we must go through in order to demonstrate all the work we've done.
Okay. So just trying to put it in a little more plain English here. So when you're going and you're building your fitness, you are putting in a lot of hours, you're putting in intensity, you're building, you're getting stronger and stronger and stronger, but you're also getting more tired, right? I mean, the fatigue is building in. So with the taper, you want to be able to hold on to the fitness and eliminate the fatigue, right?
Yeah, that's really the gist of it.
Okay.
Is you spent all this time. There's no such thing as a free lunch, right? So in order to build fitness, you must with it have fatigue, right?
Mhm.
And and so now is that kind of period where you you re, you just change things up enough it's a balance, right? It's a heavy balance because you don't just like take 2 weeks off, take 3 weeks off. You don't do that. That's not a taper. A taper is just talk about more of it later, but it's like a little microcosm of training that reduces fatigue, right, over the course of time, so that you hold fitness as high as possible, and remove as much fatigue as possible, right? And that's kind of the give and take of it, right? You will be you will be, say, slightly less fit on race day because of the taper, right? But but if you don't taper, you will not be able to access the fitness that you would have had you not tapered, had you tapered, I'm sorry, right?
Mhm.
So you gotta give a little to get a little,
You
right?
get a lot.
And to get a lot, right? Yeah, to get a lot. You gotta
Yeah.
give a little to get a lot, right? And that's what it really boils down to. I think, yeah, that's I'll just leave it at that. I think that answers the
Okay.
question for the most part, right?
Yeah. And I mean, and just hitting on that, why athletes are uncomfortable with it because they're like, oh my God, I've been training and training. And now it's like 2 weeks before my most important race. What are you telling me? I'm supposed to back down? That is. And then all of a sudden they have more time to think about what's coming up. And
I think the primary struggles with the taper are more to do with psychology than they are physicality, right?
yeah,
It's accepting the fact, right? And it's accepting the fact that um y- you're human. We are all human, and each of us, therefore, because we are human, must rest in order to access our fitness, right? And I think a lot of us think that we're different. I don't need to rest in order to access my fitness. It's a bunch of BS. You must rest.
mhm,
In order and now what's the hard part is how much do you
right.
need to rest? And that is athlete dependent, right? That really varies depending upon the athlete and their individual context, right? Um, so it's not there's not just I guess the word taper implies a singular thing called taper. No, no, no. There's taper, and then there's a bunch of different kinds of
Right.
tapers, right? And and not to say that there's, three or four. There's just the way one tapers, right? Now we may use certain approaches and taper structures, right? But even within those structures, you would vary it for the individual athlete depending upon what they may need. You know, yeah.
Yeah,
My
so
day before race.
how do you figure that out? Like for the individual, how do you individualize a taper?
So I think the first area to do that is to kind of like in your mind, well, you got this period of taper, right? Okay. Now, within that taper, we have we have some buckets, right? Some athletes need a long taper, some athletes need a short taper, some athletes need something in between. Okay.
Mhm,
Now you drop your athlete into their bucket, right? Depending upon them. Then once we've determined whether an athlete's going to have a long taper, a medium taper, or a short taper, then which we traditionally just call them A, B, C, which is like maybe the least creative name possible, and also implies a ranking system, which like as if A is the best taper and C is the word. No, 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 no. So it's just a bad name, right? And just in the so now once we know what the length of an athlete's taper, I think the individuality of that taper comes in the form of making sure that the training week looks as much like the taper weeks. I'm sorry, the taper weeks look as much like the training weeks as possible, but smaller, right? So they're like in Austin Powers, they are the mini me's of training weeks, right?
mhm,
Exactly like the training week in every single way, except a smaller size, right? They're scaled down versions. The training stimuli are the same, and but the layout is mostly the same. The
mhm,
volume is less, all
mhm,
right? And as is the training stimulus is also there's less intent. There's less of it, but it's the same kind of stimulus, right? And so you the individuality comes in taking into account like, okay, how has this athlete been training for these past 4 or 5 weeks, right?
mhm.
Make it look like that. Let's scale it down. Make a mini
Okay.
me version.
Okay. So, but how in terms of like, do you know, should this decrease in volume essentially? How do you know if it should be a few days, week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? Like, how do you make that decision?
In terms of the so that's now we're in the bucket, right? We're in that we're defining which say bucket the athlete's going to fall into.
Hmm.
Long, medium, short. That's really it depends upon a few different factors, and like you kind of have to like massage it some and say, okay, so like the long taper would typically be for an athlete who is more anaerobically natured if they have a high training volume, right?
Mhm.
That's somebody who's going to need more rest, right? But if you have an athlete who's more anaerobically natured with low training volume, you may need you may need to put them in, say, a medium taper, right? Because you wouldn't want them to have too much downtime
Mhm.
because they would start to run out of fitness. Not run out of fitness, but that balancing act that optimization
Mhm.
equation that you're trying to create wouldn't be optimized if that taper is too long because their training is the training volume is on the lower side. So I'm sorry, the anaerobic athlete and or the really high volume athlete would tend to be in that A bucket, that longer taper, right? You have your then you have your say your more aerobically based athlete, okay, and your more aerobically based athlete would tend to fall somewhere in the B or C buckets, the medium and the short taper, depending upon their training volume. Okay, so if you have a high aerobic high volume aerobic athlete, they're going to tend to be in the in the B. And if you have if you have an aerobic athlete who's lower volume, they'll be in the C. Now, but hold on, there's a couple versions of aerobic, right? You have your athletes who are a little more aerobically natured. Then you have your athletes who are really aerobic, like crazy aerobic. And they would tend to be in the C column.
Okay.
Um, and that's kind of like we do a lot of say like testing with athletes to kind of understand where their physiology, where their physiology lands. And if you look at an athlete, say, um, if you compare their ability to go really hard over a short period of time versus, you know, how they perform over a long interval, if that's pretty flat, that's an athlete who's very aerobically natured, and they're going to be somebody who requires a shorter taper.
Okay. So like someone, if I sent someone to the track and said, I want you to run a 400 and a mile, and their pace is about the same for both of those distances, then they're aerobic. But if it's, Usain Bolt, like he's an anaerobic athlete, right?
Oh,
I mean,
yeah, yeah,
clearly aerobic athlete, much
yeah.
faster in the short. So, now how about the race distance? How does that factor into the length of a taper? If someone's doing an Ironman versus doing a, you know, half marathon or a, sprint distance triathlon, how does that factor in?
Well, let's think about the fatigue factor, right? Let's go back to that original equation, which is not equation, the original question, which was what is this taper, right? The taper is this period of time when we're taking fatigue off of the body so to be able to access fitness. Okay. So then we have to ask our question, what's the most important question now? The most important question now is um, based upon the distance, right? Is it more is it more important to be sharp than rested? Or is it more important to be rested than sharp, right? So if you are doing something like an Ironman or half Ironman, it's going to tend to be more important to be rested, right? If you're doing a shorter race, like a half marathon or a sprint or an Olympic, it's more important to be sharp, right? Because, if so let's take the longer distance as an example. If because remember we're dealing with like a little balancing act. It is not easy, right? To manage the taper, to know exactly what's right? But we can get pretty close. We can get pretty damn close, right? And so you want to if you're going to err, right? You want to err on one side or the other. In an
Mhm.
Ironman, you want to err on the side of being rested, right? Because if an athlete gets out onto the bike and the water isn't just flowing from their legs, typically speaking, but they are rested. They're just the sharpness isn't quite there. That sharpness will come. You give it
Mhm.
5, 10 miles, and they'll get into the flow, right? And so you want to make sure that they have the ability to get into the flow. But now, in that flow is going to come from being rested in the first place. Versus if you go into the race sharp but unrested, right? Well, I guess you just wouldn't. Yeah, you just got. Yeah, I guess there would be no such. It, it wouldn't. It just wouldn't work like that training for an Ironman. Like to go into, you couldn't do all of that training volume, and go into an event sharp but unrested, right? Yeah. Um. So that's, I guess that's how you make the decision on on how to decide what an athlete needs relative to the distance that they're racing. What's the demand of the race? Shorter race, sharp; longer race, rested.
So sometimes athletes do, you know, one race a year or two races a year. Sometimes they do 10 races a year. And a taper, you are going to start losing some fitness. I mean, some. And then race day, you're going to be pretty tired, so you can't bounce back. So a week after the race, now you've lost fitness, right? So do you always do you taper for every race, or is it more just geared towards the like the key races in the year?
I would, I mean, I would highly recommend tapering for. I would recommend tapering twice a year. Okay, and it's always funny to me when an athlete says sends a race schedule and you ask, okay, A, B, and C, please label the races, and it's like A, right? B, C, right? And like we got to reverse that, right? Because of exactly what you just said in terms of the more you taper, the you're gonna lose fitness, right? And like you are going to lose it. So you want to maintain as much fitness as possible. I would think of it less about races and more about the idea of macro cycles, right? So a macro cycle being somewhere between like 16 to 28 weeks of training of progressive build over the course of time. Um, and the taper is the period that falls at the end of the macro cycle. Okay. And so understand that there needs to be a macro cycle. Okay, what's the A race, right? And the A race is here. All right, we take our macro cycle, slide it in so that it falls at the end of the taper. Anything else needs to probably be a recovery week type race, or
Mhm.
I guess prioritized less, right? You don't taper for I I guess you don't really taper for a race. You taper for a time period. Like when I work with professional athletes that they don't have the same demands as age group athletes with regards to registration, right? They can hop around into different races at different times. They like an age group athlete, they have to sign up for this race on this day, and that's now you're committed, right? Um, and so that's a very simple kind of like, okay, we need to be tapered on this day, right? And when you have the same kind of discussion with somebody who has more flexibility in their race schedule, now you're looking at like, okay, when are we going to be in shape, right? Okay, there's a few different. I don't know which race I want to do, but there's a few races that are clumped together on a calendar, right? And I would probably do one or two of those. Okay, let's build towards that time frame such that will descend on the taper as we have a better understanding of which plane you're going to get on, right? And then and so to think about it less about a race and more about a time frame. Now, the thing with age group athletes, right, is that that time frame is defined by the race, right? So, to answer your question, uh, I, I would recommend not tapering, say, more than twice a year, maybe three times, but that would be really pushing it. You would have to really shrink a macro cycle down, which is definitely doable, definitely possible.
So last year, I mean, as you know, I'm generally not a long course athlete, but last year I did two Ironmans in 8 weeks from each other. And that was a struggle, like because I had to perform well enough on the first one to get the world's qualification to do the second one. But I was pretty tired after the first one. So what are your thoughts like on that, the bounce back? that quickly if you need to.
I would think of that as being kind of similar to how like a f- in the Olympics, the 5K is there's semifinals and quarter. There's a semifinal in the 5K, right? In the
On the
Olympics?
track. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
on the track. So I would think of it kind of from that perspective. Like if you need to really let it all out in order to get to the finals, then you taper for the semifinals, right?
Hmm.
And then you throw caution to the wind for the finals.
Hmm.
Not, I mean, I don't mean throw caution to the wind, but that becomes secondary, right?
Hmm.
And if you are somebody who's very comfortable that like I'm gonna get to the finals,
Hmm.
um, then you would taper towards the later race. That's how I would approach that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to do an Ironman without some rest is, I don't know, maybe some people could do it. I certainly couldn't, some, but I don't think I went through a full taper going into Lake Placid to try and not lose too much fitness, and then
Right, right,
that taper
right.
got pushed. So, yeah.
Yeah. But you're an athlete who didn't need to say gamble too much in order to get your Kona slot, right? The odds were decent that you were going to get your Kona slot
Yeah.
untapered, right? Like and so it's it's a reasonable thing to put this to have the vision
Hmm.
towards the longer viewed race, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's a tough one. I I always found the Placid Kona double was tough
Yeah.
because like you you it's in that what was it 8 weeks left and but that was Nice, right? But it traditionally it's like 10 to 12 weeks, and it's just long enough to like get back, and
Yeah.
also at the same time too long, right?
Hmm.
You just like it's 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 hard, and that's when we make a mistake as athletes and as coaches, absolutely make a mistake, is we forget about the 15 years of training, of fitness wealth that we have built up over the course of time that bridges that gap. So we only think about the macro cycle we're in, right? Because we become very myopic, right? And we completely lose sight of a lifetime of training, right? That's going to carry us the rest of the way, right?
Hmm.
That's we all make the mistake. We just do. It's and so it's hard to, and that's why it's important to think about it. Try to think about these things from, 30,000 feet as best you can, right? Um, because if you only look at it as from a time frame from like March through October, right? Like, oh my goodness, I have a lot of work to do, right? But if you think about like all the fitness wealth that you have from all of those Marches through Octobers and beyond, right? You got a lot of momentum pushing you towards that finish line, right?
Yeah.
Um, you can really ride a pretty good wave with that.
Yeah. And one thing that you talked about with professional athletes, like I feel like they also race more, or they can race. I mean, they have the ability to race more. It's what they do, for a living. And that's, is it still the same kind of thing though that if they're doing 4 Ironmans in a year, or 470.3s and 2 Ironmans, that they would still need to pick which races are their key races, or
And the I think one of the big misnomers that occurs is that we think that professional athletes are different than other athletes. They're not. They're just faster at the thing that everyone else is doing. They're still human. They are still subject to the same kinds of things, right? Then maybe it doesn't necessarily manifest in the same exact kind of ways, and there's a lot of ways to skin different cats, right? But just because an athlete is a professional athlete doesn't mean that they can um, say taper down into, well, no, that it has less to do with the professional piece, taper down into a race, get back to training, and then taper down into another race. It has less to do with the professional piece and more to do with, I guess I'll talk about that training wealth again, right? If you have a boatload of fitness over years and years and years, right? You can afford to shed a little bit of it in a taper because it'll come back. Like you're only when you're dipping down, you're not dipping down very far. You're dipping down some, and you can get back, right? So
Mhm.
these athletes, they they I would say that they do have an ability to. I guess I'm going to contradict myself. They do have an ability to do a little more tapering for races, but it's not because they're professionals. It's because they have they have training. They just have greater training level because they're able to put more durability and time into it, right? Because you don't lose the fitness when you're tapered down. That's not the thing. You're kind of losing the durability, right? The being able to hold the speed potential over a long, long period of time, right? That's the thing that we that's the balancing act. The fitness piece is going to be in pretty good place for, 2 to 4 weeks, right? Um, and so these athletes who train at really, really high volumes, they never really lose that durability piece, right?
Mhm.
That's the way I would look at that. So they do have the ability to descend to take some short quick tapers into a big Ironman kind of thing. Um,
Right. So let me ask you like the flip side of it now. Like I'm on a whole bunch of Facebook groups, and so you see all these, interesting questions. And one that you see a lot is I was supposed to do my 6 hour bike ride leading up to my Ironman, and I had to miss it. And now my Ironman is next week. Should I make it? Should I make it up? But this panic train concept, right? I didn't get in all my training and then trying to cram it in before. So what do you say to that person?
um, that's the kind of thing that somebody does when they what's the federal government allow? Federal government allows you to make extra 401k. Um, uh, you can give more to your 401k after a certain age, right?
Mhm,
Which people do when they haven't been investing in their 401k for the since 20 or 25, right? So they try to make it up, right?
mhm,
Fine. But if you're somebody who's been investing, like you don't need to make that. You don't need to panic. You don't need to panic invest, right? Same with training. If you've been training all through the time, right? There's no need for panic training. You have wealth. You have fitness wealth, right? And that's I mean what that boils down to is that's anxiety talking, right? That's not
mhm.
fitness talking. That's anxiety talking. And when when we when we enter into a taper period, we are asking somebody to uh what's it, the Rolling Stone gathers no moss, right? Like we are asking them to change what they've been doing, right? And and or as much as they've been doing, and now they've had more time to sit around, more time to think, more time to realize what is and isn't, and and that's when the danger creeps in, right? And that's the thing that feeds the the panic training. But I think if the more that you can help an athlete to realize everything that they've done, right? Just in the same way that when you go to a financial advisor, they talk you through like, no, you're in a good spot. You're in a great spot to be able to retire in the next few years, blah, blah, blah. Right. When you have that person assurance, when you have that assurance, right, that you are in a good spot, because you don't know, like you have no idea, like that whether or not you have enough. Um,
Mhm.
enough whatever, you fill in the blank, right? Because you don't know what that thing is at the on the other side, right? And and so you kind of need somebody to give you that little bit of assurance, like you're good,
Mhm.
right? Um, and if you're not, well, it's probably too late, but particularly the week before. It's like that's I mean, that's just a I would I would um I would they say there's no such thing as a dumb question, but that's a dumb question that the athlete would ask, right? Because it shouldn't be asked. You shouldn't even like it's it's the answer is just flat out no. You know, like
Yeah, it's flat out no. I mean, and if they've been training and they just happened like they were sick that day and they had to miss that one ride, that's a whole different question than they
exactly
missed,
right.
Training Peak showed up red, for
Mhm.
weeks, weeks and weeks. Then riding 6 hours on the Wednesday before the Ironman's not going to make it,
No, not a hill of beans difference.
it's not gonna, yeah.
But that's where the psychology of the athlete comes in, and like we like our greens and training peaks. Like those are really important to us, to the point where we fool ourselves, right? Where I mean the lies we pull are outrageous. Like we have a day where we miss a workout, we can't handle the red so much that we move the workout as if it was never scheduled, therefore it wasn't missed, right? Like it's
Or delete a
the
workout.
like
Even worse.
yeah, it's delusional, right?
It's like, I know I put that workout in there, where'd it
Yeah,
go?
yeah. Let me fix my anxiety by just going, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, but I mean, at the end of the day, how it should look, hopefully, in a perfect world, you've got your race, you build, you build, you build, you have your mini rests along the way just to recover your body. But to perform well on race day, you need to step back,
You got
let
to take
yourself.
off you got to take off the cloak of fatigue,
Yeah.
right? And otherwise otherwise your training looks and feels exactly like it has always looked and looked and felt. It's just there's less of it, right? And that's yeah, it's a necessary evil.
Yeah. I don't know. Part of my thing is like all winter long and I'm doing my off season. I feel like the off season goes on and on and on. And then I get to season, I was like, can I go back to off season? I'm not ready. And I've
Hmm.
been racing, I don't know, 25 years and I still have that, feel sometimes. But
Hmm. Hmm.
then you say, well,
Hmm.
just look at everything you did. You are ready, So if
Yeah.
you do, do the work, take the taper.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's at the end of the day, as long as we're doing like the endurance sports things, right? We're gonna be ready, and we're gonna be pretty damn close to ready. The really the primary thing that's gonna make us unready is really more about like the fine tuning the performance, right? And the way to fine tune that performance is make sure that you can access all of the fitness that you have, right? So more training in a time when you need to be resting is actually killing the performance, right? You're taking instruments out of the orchestra, right? With all the training that you do during the taper, right?
Mhm.
We need to be making sure that everybody can hear all of the instruments in
Mhm.
the we need not to be taking instruments out, right? That's the but where we get a little crazy, a little type A.
Little bit, a little bit.
But at the
So,
same time, every brain, and there's an infinite number of brains, right, is is in the same kind of human body, right? And that human body needs certain things, one of which is rest,
right.
right? So, and just how do you define that rest is where the nuance lands, right?
Mhm. Yeah. All right, Tim. Thank you so much for taking on this subject and giving all your knowledge on it. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thanks.